The flashlight hit Terrence Boone's face before the officer said a single word. Hands where I can see them. Boone's palms were already flat against the hood of his own truck. Fingers spread, breath even. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. 9 years of federal law enforcement had taught him that the first 30 seconds of a bad stop decide everything that follows, and arguing was never part of surviving them. "Sir, I need you to step back and let me explain." I said, hands where I can see them. Deputy Cole Ratner's voice cracked through the cold air like a slammed door. He was younger than his crew cut suggested, built like a man who'd spent more time in a gym than a classroom, and right now his hand hovered an inch above his holster like it belonged there. 2 blocks away, in a rented room with the blinds drawn, a man named Curtis Vale was watching the police lights bloom red and blue against his ceiling and reaching for his jacket. But Boone didn't know that yet. All he knew was that the badge clipped inside his jacket, the one that could end this in 5 seconds, was the same badge that had gotten him thrown against his own hood in the first place. "There's a shield in my left jacket pocket," Boone said, voice level. "U.S. Marshal's service. I'm going to move slow. You're not moving anything." Ratner's partner, Deputy Priya Anand, stood at the passenger side, flashlight low. Her weight shifted back on her heels like she wasn't sure she was standing in the right spot. She'd run the plates herself 20 minutes ago. Nothing had come back. No warrant, no stolen report, no reason at all except a truck parked on a street it hadn't been parked on before. Unfamiliar vehicle. Dispatch had logged it. 3 burglaries on this block in 2 weeks. A black man behind the wheel of a truck nobody recognized, sitting still in the dark for 40 minutes. That was the whole case against him. Ratner grabbed Boone's wrist and twisted it up his back. "We had 4 calls about break-ins on this street. You want to explain what you're doing sitting out here for 40 minutes with your lights off?" "I can't," Boone said. It wasn't defiance. It was the truth, and it cost him something to say it. Somewhere behind those drawn blinds, a task force he'd spent 4 months building was one wrong word from collapsing, and the wrong word might be the very sentence that would set him free right now. Ratner took the silence as guilt. "Cuff him," he said. Anand didn't move for a second, just long enough that Ratner turned and repeated it, sharper. "Cuff him, Priya." Her hands were steady when she pulled the cuffs from her belt. Her eyes weren't. She'd looked at Boone's face twice already, and something about the stillness in it didn't match anything she'd learned to expect from a burglary suspect. Burglary suspects sweated. Burglary suspects talked too fast, or not at all, eyes darting for an exit. This man's breathing hadn't changed once. The metal closed cold around Boone's wrists. A porch light clicked on across the street. Then another. A woman in a bathrobe stepped onto her front steps, phone already rising, camera already recording. "That's enough," Boone said quietly. "Reach into my jacket. Left side. You'll find exactly what I told you." Ratner reached in, not gently, and pulled the badge free. He held it up to his flashlight, the way a man examines a counterfeit bill, turning it, squinting. "This a joke?" "No, sir. Because it looks like something you buy off a website." Ratner pocketed it without looking at it twice. "We'll figure out what's real back at the station." Boone closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. 2 blocks away, a back door he'd watched for 4 months eased open into an alley, and a man he'd never get to arrest tonight stepped out into the dark and started walking. "Move," Ratner said, and shoved him toward the cruiser. That was when Anand saw it, a detail so small it would mean nothing to anyone else on this street tonight. As Ratner folded Boone into the back seat, his radio, still clipped open on his shoulder, crackled with a voice from 20 minutes earlier, a voice none of them had thought to mute. "Copy, unfamiliar vehicle, occupants a black male, requesting backup before we've even got eyes on a call, before the burglar reports, before dispatch confirmed anything, before there was a reason at all." Anand stood very still on the sidewalk, staring at her own radio, and for the first time all night, said nothing. Anand just heard something that could blow this whole arrest apart, and she hasn't said a word yet. Does she speak up or stay silent? Drop your prediction below, like and subscribe, because things are about to get a lot worse before they get better. Anand was still staring at her own radio when Ratner slammed the cruiser door on Boone and turned back to her. "You good?" "Yeah." She wasn't. The playback kept looping in her head, her own voice, 20 minutes before dispatch mentioned a single burglary, calling in a black male in an unfamiliar vehicle like the color of his skin was the probable cause. She hadn't heard it that way in the moment. She was hearing it now. Then let's go, Ratner said, already walking back to his own car. Guy'll talk once he's processed. He wouldn't. Boone had decided that the second the cuffs closed. Not out of stubbornness, out of arithmetic. 4 months of surveillance, 3 confidential informants, a joint federal investigation with the bureau that named Curtis Vale as the last loose thread in a fugitive network that had already put 2 people in the ground. 1 sentence in the wrong direction, I'm watching that house, and every asset he'd built would be radioactive by morning, whether Vale ran tonight or not. So Boone said nothing, and the cruiser pulled away from the curb, and 2 blocks behind them, in an alley he could no longer see, Curtis Vale climbed into a car that wasn't his and drove north. 2 years earlier, Boone had stood in a different kind of dark, a hospital corridor in Bethesda, filling out an incident report he assumed would end his career. He'd rerouted a protective convoy on instinct, without waiting for approval, minutes before the intersection they'd been headed toward went up in flame. No medal came out of it. Just a violation of protocol that happened to save the life of a JAG officer whose mother, a 2-star general at the time, found Boone in that corridor 3 hours later and signed her own name under his on the report before anyone asked her to. You did the one thing regulations don't have a box for, she'd told him. Good judgment. Her name was Adele Marsh. They hadn't spoken in 18 months. That didn't make the debt smaller. At the station, the fluorescent lights hummed the way they always did, indifferent to what they were lighting. Boone sat on a bench with his hands still cuffed in front of him now, a small mercy nobody had explained. Ratner filled out the arrest report at a desk 20 feet away, writing fast, the story already fixed in his head before the details caught up to it. Suspicious activity, uncooperative, refused to explain presence at scene. Every word true and every word a lie, depending on which side of the badge you were standing on. Anand stood near the door longer than she needed to. Cole. She said it quietly. That recording. Before dispatch even had a burglary description up. You called it in before we had anything. I called in what I saw. You called in a black guy in a truck. That's it. That's all there was. Ratner didn't look up from the report. You want to file that somewhere. File it. I've got a report to finish. She didn't move for a second. Then she walked to her own desk, opened a blank incident log, and started writing down exactly what she remembered. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because some part of her had already decided she wasn't going to be the only person who remembered it accurately. A duty sergeant approached the bench with a phone. You get 1 call. Boone had expected this moment to feel smaller than it did. He didn't dial a lawyer. He dialed a 4-digit extension he'd had memorized for 9 years. His task force supervisor. A man named Reyes, who picked up on the second ring with the particular flatness of someone used to bad news arriving after midnight. Boone. I'm in Haverford County lockup. Local PD picked me up on the Vale surveillance. I couldn't explain the op without blowing it, so I didn't. Vale made the lights and ran. I need someone to verify my credentials before this gets any worse, and I need the bureau to know the safe house is burned. There was a long pause on the other end, the kind Reyes only used when he was doing 3 things at once. Copy on Vale. I'll get that moving. Another pause. You said Haverford County? Yeah, Boone. Something changed in Reyes's voice, careful now, almost disbelieving. 4-star General Adele Marsh landed at Norfolk 2 hours ago. She's 20 minutes from where you're sitting. Boone said nothing for a moment, the phone cold against his ear, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like they were waiting to see what he'd say next. Don't call her, he said finally. Not for this. Too late, Reyes said. I already did. Boone set the phone down slowly. Reyes was still talking. Something about pulling strings, about not making this bigger than it needed to be, but Boone had already stopped hearing it. 20 minutes. He did the math the way he did everything else, without letting it show on his face. The duty sergeant took the phone back and nodded toward a door marked Booking, like it was the next stop on a tour nobody wanted to be on. Ratner was waiting for him there, report finished, shoulders loose in a way they hadn't been on the street. Confidence looked different on him indoors, quieter, more comfortable, the kind that didn't need an audience anymore because he'd already decided how this story ended. Hands, the booking officer said, and Boone gave them 10 fingers pressed one at a time into black ink and then onto a card that would exist somewhere in a database long after tonight was over, whatever tonight turned out to mean. Face forward. A flash went off. Turn left. Another flash. Boone had stood for one photograph in his life that mattered. Dress uniform, department seal behind him, the kind of picture that goes in a personnel file and gets pulled out at retirement. This one would go in the same kind of file, for exactly the opposite reason, and nobody in the room seemed to notice the difference. "Guy your surveillance target was watching," Ratner said, leaning against the doorframe, not quite looking at Boone when he said it. "Dispatch says the house came back empty. Neighbor saw somebody leave through the back around the time we picked you up." He said it like a fact he'd stumbled onto, not a consequence he'd caused. "Guess your shortcut story's got some holes in it too." Boone didn't answer. There was nothing to correct. Vale was gone, the safe house was burned, and 4 months of work had ended in an alley 2 blocks from where Boone was standing in ink and fluorescent light. And none of that changed by arguing with a man who'd already made up his mind before either of them opened their mouths. He thought of Razor's voice on the phone, copy on Vale, "I'll get that moving," and understood, with the particular stillness of a man absorbing a loss he can't yet grieve, that moving wasn't the same as recovering. At her desk, Anand typed a name into the federal personnel lookup she hadn't used since her academy days, mostly out of habit, mostly because she needed something to do with her hands that wasn't finishing Ratner's paperwork. Boone, Terrence A. The system took 11 seconds to return a result. Deputy U.S. Marshal, 9 years of service. Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Class of a year she recognized, because her cousin had gone through the same year. Active credential status. Verified. She stared at the screen the way you stare at something that confirms exactly what you were afraid of, and gives you no comfort at all for having been right. She thought about walking it over to the booking room. She thought about what Ratner's face would do, and what her own career would do sitting 3 feet away from his for the next 11 years if she made him wrong in front of everyone tonight. She thought about the log she'd already started, sitting open in another tab, half-written, the truth already down on the page even if she hadn't shown it to anyone yet. She closed the lookup. She didn't close the log. Not yet, she told herself. Not like this. Not alone. It didn't feel like courage. It felt like waiting. She would spend a long time afterward trying to explain the difference to herself, and not entirely succeeding. Back in booking, a deputy Boone hadn't seen before pushed a clipboard across the counter without looking up. "Sign here for your personal effects." Boone signed. His wallet. His phone, already dead from 4 hours of surveillance he'd never get credit for. And beneath both of theirs, listed on its own line like an afterthought, one badge, U.S. Marshal Service Authenticity Unconfirmed. He read the word unconfirmed twice. He didn't say anything about it. There wasn't a sentence in the English language calm enough to say what he was thinking without making it worse for himself, and he'd learned that lesson a long time before tonight. Ratner had drifted toward the front desk, trading a joke with another deputy, something about paperwork and overtime, his voice easy and unbothered in the particular way of a man who has never once considered that the next 10 minutes might undo him. That was when the headlights swept across the front windows of the station, twice, from 2 vehicles arriving together, moving in the kind of formation that doesn't belong to anyone who's used to waiting for permission. Ratner's joke died mid-sentence. The deputy at the front desk stood up so fast her chair rolled backward into the wall. Every head in the building turned toward the glass doors at once. The doors opened, and General Adele Marsh walked into the Haverford County Station like the building already belonged to her. Dress uniform, dark blue, 4 silver stars catching the fluorescent light on each shoulder. 2 aides flanked her, half a step behind, moving in the kind of formation nobody has to be taught. She didn't look at the front desk. She didn't look at Ratner, frozen mid-sentence by the counter, or at the deputy still writing her fallen chair. She walked straight toward the booking room, like she'd been given directions by someone who already knew exactly where Boone was standing. He was still in ink and cuffs when she found him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Marsh looked at his wrists, at the black smudged across his fingertips, at the clipboard on the counter with the word unconfirmed still visible on the top line. Something moved behind her eyes, not surprise. Recognition of a debt she hadn't finished paying. Then General Adele Marsh drew herself to full height, squared her shoulders, and raised her hand in a salute. It wasn't protocol. Nothing required a four-star general to salute a deputy US Marshal standing in handcuffs in a booking room. She wasn't doing it because the uniform demanded it. She was doing it because 2 years ago a man had rerouted a convoy on instinct and never once mentioned it to anyone who could have made him a hero for it. And tonight, that same man had been made to look like exactly the opposite of what he was. In public, in cuffs, in ink, and she intended to correct that in the same room where it had happened, in front of the same people who had watched it. The station went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The particular silence of a room realizing, all at once, that something has gone catastrophically wrong. Ratner's face lost color by degrees, like a man watching weather change on the horizon, and realizing too late it was heading straight for him. Marsh lowered her hand and turned to face the room. Who is responsible for this? It wasn't a question. Nobody in the room mistook it for one. Ratner stepped forward, because there was no version of this where he didn't have to. Ma'am, I conducted a stop based on a pattern of break-ins in the area. And I didn't ask for a pattern. Marsh's voice stayed level, which made it worse. I asked who is responsible for putting a federal officer in handcuffs and logging his credentials as unconfirmed without picking up a phone. Ratner started and stopped, because there was no sentence that finished that thought without ending him. Pull the body camera footage, Marsh said to the sergeant standing frozen by the door. Both officers. Now. It took 9 minutes to load. 9 minutes in which nobody in the room spoke, and Anand stood near her desk with her hand resting on the edge of a monitor, on a tab she still hadn't closed. The footage played on a screen in the sergeant's office. Marsh watched with her arms crossed, unmoving. It showed Ratner's hand near his holster before a single word was exchanged. It showed the badge pulled from Boone's jacket, turned over once under a flashlight, and dismissed. It showed the search, the cuffs, the word unconfirmed written down like a verdict. And then, 20 minutes before any of it, buried in an earlier clip nobody had thought to check, it showed Ratner's own radio call. Unfamiliar vehicle. Occupants a black male. Requesting backup before dispatch had connected a single burglary report to that street, before there was anything at all to justify the words leaving his mouth. That's not what I meant. Ratner said, to no one in particular, to everyone. It's exactly what you meant, Marsh said. You said it before you had a reason to. That was when Anand crossed the room, a printed page in her hand, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. There's more. She set the page on the sergeant's desk. I ran his credentials 40 minutes ago. Active. Verified. 9 years of service. I wrote down everything I remembered while it was still fresh, because I didn't trust myself to remember it right later. She looked at Ratner for the first time since the footage started. I should have said something in the parking lot. I'm saying it now. Marsh studied her for a long moment, not unkindly. That took more than you think it did. Outside the sergeant's office, a deputy at the front desk was already fielding a call from dispatch, low and urgent. And behind her, unnoticed by everyone still absorbing what had just happened in the booking room, a phone had been recording since the moment the headlights swept across the front windows, held by a woman in the parking lot who'd pulled over out of curiosity and never put it down. By the time Boone's cuffs came off, the video had already left the parking lot, and by morning Ratner wouldn't be answering questions from his sergeant. He'd be answering them from people much higher up the chain of command. By 9 the next morning, Deputy Cole Ratner was no longer answering to his sergeant. He sat across a folding table from 2 investigators out of the department's professional standards office, his own body cam footage playing on a laptop between them. His radio call from the night before looped twice, so there could be no argument about what he'd said and when he'd said it. He tried the pattern of break-ins explanation one more time. Nobody in the room bothered writing it down. Sheriff Marlene Cobb, 5 months into the job and not interested in spending any of her remaining credibility protecting a 15-year deputy, suspended him without pay before noon. The federal referral went out an hour after that, raising the possibility of a federal civil rights investigation for deprivation of rights under color of law. The kind of charge that doesn't care how long you've worn a badge, only what you did with it. Ratner would spend the next several months learning the particular loneliness of being the reason everyone else in a building has to answer questions they didn't sign up for. Anand kept her badge, the written log she'd started before anyone asked her to, time-stamped, unprompted, sitting quietly in a system nobody had told her to open. became the piece of evidence the department's attorneys leaned on hardest, because it existed before the outcome did. Cobb didn't discipline her for the 40 minutes she'd spent deciding whether to speak up. She reassigned her to the department's new compliance unit instead, the one being built specifically because of what had happened in that booking room. "You hesitated," Cobb told her, in an office considerably quieter than the one Ratner was sitting in. "You also came forward before anyone made you. That's the part I'm choosing to remember." Anand didn't feel like she'd earned it. She took the job anyway, because the alternative was pretending the 40 minutes hadn't happened, and she'd already decided she wasn't going to do that. Curtis Vale was picked up 19 days later, 400 miles away, at a gas station his sister had once mentioned to a confidential informant back in June, a detail Boone had logged before any of this started, and passed to the Bureau the same night he was released. The arrest made 2 paragraphs in a regional paper. Nobody outside the task force ever knew it closed a case that had nearly ended in an alley, because 2 officers wouldn't let a man finish a sentence. Boone read the notification on his phone, standing in his own kitchen, and allowed himself exactly one long breath before he went back to the report he was writing. 3 weeks after the story broke, Boone was invited to speak at a joint training session between the Marshal Service and 4 county sheriff's departments, Haverford's among them. He hadn't wanted to go. Reyes had asked him twice before he agreed. He stood in front of a room of deputies, some of them, he suspected, thinking about their own worst instincts on their own worst nights, and he didn't raise his voice once. "I had documents in my pocket that answered every question you could have asked me," he said. "The problem was never information. The problem was who got to be believed while offering it." He paused, let the room sit with that instead of filling the silence for them. "Verify first. It costs you 30 seconds. The alternative costs someone else everything." Cobb sat in the back row. 2 weeks later, her department adopted a new protocol. Any credential presented during a stop that couldn't be immediately verified by radio required a supervisor's sign-off before an arrest could proceed, not after. 3 neighboring counties adopted the same policy within the year, quietly, without press releases, the way real change usually happens. General Adele Marsh didn't attend the training session. She sent Boone a single line instead, the same week the department's new policy was announced. "Debt's not fully paid. Doesn't mean it isn't closer." He kept the message. He didn't need it to feel finished. Some things don't require closure to matter. On a Tuesday evening that October, Boone drove home through Briarwood the long way, past the station, out of habit more than necessity. The lights were off inside. A new sign by the front door listed the department's revised stop procedures in plain language, the kind meant to be read by someone standing exactly where he'd once stood, hands on a hood, waiting to be believed. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. He drove on, past the porch lights of a neighborhood that no longer felt like a place he had to explain himself to, toward a house where nobody would ask him to prove who he was before they let him through the door. This story reminds us that dignity should never depend on a uniform, a title, or someone's assumptions. The truth may be ignored for a moment, but it becomes powerful when someone has the courage to stand beside it. If you were standing beside Anand that night, would you have spoken up immediately, or would you have hesitated too? Tell me honestly in the comments. If this story meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes truth should matter before power does. This story is a work of fiction, created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration,